We're about to dive deep into the hidden world of medieval spies, where deception was an art form, loyalty was negotiable, and survival often depended on how well you could lie, bribe, or disappear into the shadows. This story will take you through the dangerous, secretive lives of informants, double agents, whisper networks, and the covert operations that shaped medieval politics from behind the scenes. And trust me, this isn't just about sneaky men in cloaks. Royal courts were filled with spies, enemy nations relied on code breakers and assassins, and even peasants played roles in gathering intelligence, sometimes without even realizing it. So, before we begin, subscribe now so you never miss another deep dive into history, and tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. Because if you're about to fall asleep to this story, just know that some medieval spy spent their nights much more dangerously than you. Now, close your eyes, settle in, and let's slip silently into a world where trust is a liability, information is currency, and no one, not even you, can be certain who's watching. Let's begin. You feel the weight of the message in your hand, a small scrap of parchment, folded so tightly it could be hidden between the folds of your sleeve. It isn't yours. It wasn't meant for you. But you have it now, and you know what it means. Someone has betrayed the crown. You weren't supposed to find this letter. It had been slipped from one hand to another, exchanged in whispers, intended only for the eyes of someone who was willing to pay for what it contained. But the streets are never entirely empty, and not all secrets remain hidden for long. You saw the drop, you made the grab, and now you hold evidence of treason. Names, locations, plans that should never have left the depths of candlelit chambers. What do you do now? The safest option is to pretend you never saw it, to walk away, let the intended recipient retrieve their mistake, and hope they never learn how close they were to exposure. But you hesitate, because in medieval Europe, information is power, and power can buy you anything. Gold, freedom, favor with nobles, even survival in times where trust is a death sentence. And so, instead of leaving it behind, you make a choice. You keep the letter. You tuck it deep into your coat, hidden against your chest, where no wandering eyes will see it. The streets are dark, the hour is late, and if anyone was watching, they are gone now, vanished into the city, returning to their masters, reporting that the exchange was made without interference. Except they are wrong, because the secret they thought was safe is no longer theirs alone. And you? You have just entered a world where silence is currency, shadows are weapons, and survival is determined by how well you can outplay the spies who have lived in these alleys long before you ever stepped foot on them. You are no longer just another face in the crowd. You are a threat, and someone will soon realize it. You clutch the message tighter, adjusting your pace as you weave through the dimly lit streets, careful not to draw attention. The city is never truly asleep. Even at this hour, there are always eyes, always ears, always someone lurking where they shouldn't be. You keep moving, forcing yourself not to glance over your shoulder, not to betray even the slightest hint of hesitation. Because hesitation gets people killed. Your boots scrape against uneven stone, the worn-down paths leading deeper into the heart of the city, where narrow alleyways branch off into labyrinthine corridors. You know these streets well. You've walked them 100 times, memorized every turn, every shadowed doorway. But tonight, they feel different. Tonight, you are carrying knowledge you were never meant to have. A single mistake, a misplaced step, and you could be caught. Cornered by men who operate in silence, working for masters who do not tolerate interference. You know how these things play out. You have seen it before. Suspected informants, dragged from their homes in the dead of night, their voices swallowed by the dark, their fates sealed before the city wakes to ask where they've gone. And yet, you don't stop. Because now, you are more than just an observer. You are holding something dangerous, something that can shift alliances, expose secrets, unravel everything that has been carefully constructed behind closed doors. You slip into a quieter street, away from the main roads where merchants and city guards still linger despite the hour. The parchment is tucked safely inside your coat, but it feels heavier than paper should, a weight that pulls at you, reminding you with every breath that you are no longer walking through this city as you were before. There is a choice to be made, and it is fast approaching. Because once you decide what to do next, there is no turning back. And in medieval espionage, there are never second chances. Your footsteps echo lightly against the stone, each step a measured calculation. You slow, instinct taking over, guiding you toward a quieter route. One less traveled, one less watched. The parchment tucked beneath your coat feels impossibly heavy, though its weight is not physical. You inhale slowly, scanning your surroundings, noting the familiar signs of the city winding down for the night. The merchants have finished their dealings, shutters drawn tight against the creeping cold. The taverns, though still alive with murmured conversation, no longer spill rowdy drinkers into the streets. Now, only those with purpose remain outside, and you are one of them. The message you carry is not yours, yet somehow, it has become yours the moment it slipped into your hands. You have choices, but none of them feel simple. You could take it to someone who would pay for it. Let coin decide where this secret belongs. But in this city, gold is dangerous. It does not erase suspicion, only increases it. If you are seen trading information, you are marked. And marks do not fade quickly. You could deliver it where it was meant to go, slip it back into the hands of the original recipient. Let things proceed as they were intended. Pretend you never interrupted this exchange at all. But would they know you had read it? Would they believe you had not already betrayed them, passed it along to another before returning it? Or you could hold on to it. Keep it. Keep the knowledge. Keep the risk. But nothing remains hidden for long in a city like this. You turn sharply, your coat shifting as you cut through the narrow passageway between two buildings, your mind racing through possibilities. If someone was watching, if they had seen that moment, the pause, the hesitation, the decision that led you here, they are watching still, waiting, calculating, deciding if you are worth the trouble. You exhale slowly, evening your stride, adjusting your posture, stepping forward as if the night is nothing unusual. And for now, that illusion will have to be enough. Because morning is still far away, and the city does not sleep. It only waits for whatever happens next. And whatever happens next, it will find you. Because now, you are part of it, whether you want it to be or not. And no one walks away without paying their price. Not here. Not ever. The streets stretched before you, endless and familiar, yet somehow different now that you were walking them, with the weight of an unwanted secret tucked inside your coat. You adjusted your pace, not too fast, not too slow, just enough to look like a man with a purpose, but not one with a reason to be followed. And that was the game, wasn't it? You didn't want to look like a spy, but you didn't want to look like a fool either. Because fools made mistakes, and mistakes got people killed. You'd seen it happen before. Well, not firsthand, but you'd heard the stories, whispered in dark corners over mugs of ale, told with the kind of nervous laughter that suggested people weren't sure if it was funny or just deeply unsettling. Either way, it was a warning, and if medieval Europe was good at anything, It was making sure people understood that trust was dangerous and bad decisions were worse. You stepped into the cover of an archway, pretending to adjust your boots, more to buy yourself time than anything else. You had options. None of them particularly great. But hey, beggars couldn't be choosers. Especially when the thing they were begging for was to avoid being stabbed in an alley for accidentally stealing a message that definitely wasn't theirs. Could you sell it? Maybe. Could you return it? Probably, though that meant dealing with whoever originally owned it. And you had a strong suspicion that they weren't the type to offer warm greetings and a pat on the back for being a responsible citizen. Or you could read it fully, intentionally, with no regret. Well, some regret, probably a lot of regret, but you'd already half read it, and half reading treason was pretty much the same thing as whole reading treason. So really, what did you have to lose? You unfolded the parchment with careful fingers, keeping it close, shielding it from prying eyes that might suddenly appear from the dark. The ink was neat, not the rushed scribbles of a street informant, but the deliberate hand of someone who probably sat in a very expensive chair while writing it, which meant nobility, which meant you were holding a problem much bigger than yourself. It spoke of movement, troop placements, guard rotations, supply runs to the northern border, things that were important but not immediately alarming, until you noticed the signature at the bottom. You inhaled sharply. That was a name you knew. Not personally. You weren't exactly invited to high-ranking meetings in castle halls, but you'd heard it before, spoken in low tones, by those who weren't supposed to be talking about it at all. This was not a name you wanted to be connected to. This was a name that made people disappear. And here you were, holding their very personal, very incriminating letter in your very mortal hands, which was absolutely the last place it needed to be. You pressed the parchment flat against your chest, looking up at the buildings around you like they might suddenly offer an escape route. No such luck. You weren't a trained spy. You didn't have contacts, safe houses, secret tunnels conveniently leading out of the city. You were just a man who had made a deeply unfortunate decision and now had to figure out how to not die because of it. A voice broke the silence, casual, unhurried. The kind of voice that didn't need to rush, because it already knew exactly how this was going to play out. Interesting night for a walk. You didn't turn immediately. Turning too fast meant guilt. You had exactly 3 seconds to decide how you wanted to handle this. 1. Run. No. Too obvious. 2. Lie. Probably, but not yet. 3. Look vaguely unimpressed and hope for the best. Absolutely. You exhaled slowly and faced the voice, keeping your expression somewhere between bored and slightly confused, like you had just been interrupted from contemplating the meaning of life and not, in fact, holding an incredibly dangerous piece of evidence against a high-ranking noble. The man was lean, sharp-eyed, dressed well enough to blend in with wealth, but not loudly enough to draw attention. He had the look of someone who had been watching for a while, waiting, confirming suspicions before deciding to approach. And you had exactly no good excuses for why you looked like someone who knew more than they should. Just stretching my legs, you said, which was objectively the worst answer, because nobody casually took a midnight stroll down a path favored by informants and spies, unless they were part of something they shouldn't be. The man smiled, which immediately made you more uncomfortable, because people didn't smile in situations like this unless they already knew they had the upper hand. And yet, he said smoothly, you seem rather occupied. There it was, the confirmation that I know exactly what you're holding. And now we're going to have a conversation about it. Tone. You adjusted your stance, shifting slightly. Not enough to look like you were preparing to run, but enough to remind him that you weren't just going to roll over and accept whatever fate he was about to assign you. I'm occupied with the deeply thrilling experience of walking, you said flatly, which I realize may be confusing to someone who apparently finds standing in alleyways more entertaining. It was a gamble, a small one, but some people responded well to irritation, especially the type who enjoyed playing games more than making immediate threats. You weren't going to be intimidating him into leaving, but you could make yourself just annoying enough that he had to work for it. He laughed softly, shaking his head like you had just told a mildly amusing joke, rather than attempted to derail his very obvious attempt at figuring out what you knew. I'm sure, he said, but humor me, won't you? You wouldn't be here at this hour, in this place, looking exactly as uneasy as a man who has stumbled into a situation much larger than himself. If you were just stretching your legs, you considered your options, none of which were particularly great, and settled on the temporary survival tactic of saying nothing and seeing if he got bored enough to leave. Spoiler, he didn't. He tilted his head slightly, watching you with the kind of patience that suggested he had all the time in the world to get the answers he wanted. So, he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice, why don't you tell me what you really have? And there it was. The moment where pretending wasn't going to work anymore. You exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the parchment against your chest, realizing that no amount of clever deflection was going to get you out of this conversation. You had two choices now. You could lie, or you could very carefully tell the truth and hope it didn't get you killed. Neither option was ideal. But then again, nothing in medieval espionage ever was, and tonight was only getting more complicated. You hold his gaze, your fingers twitching slightly against the parchment, the weight of the decision pressing down on you like a particularly persistent medieval tax collector. Unavoidable, unpleasant, and designed specifically to ruin your evening. You could lie. You probably should lie. But lying to this man, this sharp-eyed professional troublemaker, was likely a short road to an even worse situation, and the last thing you needed was for tonight to spiral even further into disaster. So, instead, you make a different choice. One that isn't exactly honesty, but isn't a blatant fabrication either. You shift your grip on the parchment, tilting your head slightly, keeping your expression carefully neutral, because if you look too uncertain, too eager to hide the truth, he'll know immediately. I don't suppose asking you to mind your own business would work. You say, your tone dry, measured, just enough to make it sound like you're only mildly inconvenienced by his presence, instead of actively considering whether you need to flee the city before sunrise. His mouth twitches, not quite a smile, but something close enough that you know he isn't leaving anytime soon. You could try, he admits, but let's not pretend either of us believe that would end well. Fantastic. He was not only insufferably observant, but also mildly entertained by this entire ordeal. You resist the urge to sigh, because giving any indication that you're annoyed would only encourage him to linger longer. He gestures lazily at the parchment. You're gripping like it's a dying ember, and you're the only fool left to keep the fire alive. His fingers move with purpose, controlled, precise. The kind of gestures that belong to someone who has spent years operating under the unspoken rules of deception and manipulation. You intercepted something important, he says simply, like he's stating the weather or commenting on the consistency of medieval porridge. Now you're deciding what to do with it. That means you're either incredibly reckless or unusually resourceful. Either way, you don't strike me as someone who came into this situation entirely by accident. Oh, great. Now he thought you were planning something, which, to be fair, you sort of were, though your plan mostly consisted of not dying, not getting arrested, and not becoming another anonymous body in a back alley. You shift your stance, adjusting the parchment, just enough to make him notice the movement without fully revealing what's written on it. You don't have to show it to him, not yet. But you also can't pretend it doesn't exist, because clearly, you're past the stage where pretending would be useful. I'm assuming you know exactly who this belongs to. You say carefully, watching for his reaction, waiting for the flicker of recognition, the confirmation that he understands exactly why this situation is dangerous. His expression doesn't change. A calculated decision, most likely, but there's something in his posture now, the smallest shift, the faintest tightening of his jaw, that tells you enough. He knows. And that means this is worse than you initially thought. And I'm assuming you don't plan on handing it over immediately. He replies, voice smooth, eyes assessing. That's it. He isn't asking. He already knows the answer. You feel your pulse quicken slightly, but you refuse to let it show. Now you have another problem. Because if he knows who this belongs to, and he isn't immediately demanding you return it, that means he has his own motives. And suddenly, this isn't just about survival. It's about who has the most leverage. You inhale slowly, adjusting your grip again, tilting the parchment slightly, so you can feel the edges pressing against your fingertips. It's still yours. It's still your problem. And now, you have to decide how much of it you're willing to share. And once you decide, there is no undoing it, no second chances, no simple explanations, just the truth, or something close enough to it, and the price that comes with it. Because secrets in medieval espionage never stay free for long. And tonight, you are paying in ways you never expected. You don't move, don't shift, don't let a single flicker of doubt show on your face. Even though, deep down, you know that the moment you decided not to walk away, you became part of something much larger than yourself. You have a decision to make, and now so does he. He's watching you, calculating, weighing the possibilities. You're certain he's already made several guesses about who you are, where you came from, and why you hesitated. If he's half as good as he seems, and unfortunately, you're beginning to suspect that he's much better than that, then he's already anticipated your next few moves before you've even considered them. The parchment is still pressed against your chest, folded tight between your fingers, a fragile scrap of ink, and secrets that could dictate the next several days of your life. You know that whatever happens next, this piece of information is valuable, but you also know it makes you a target. If I were you, he muses, stepping ever so slightly closer, I wouldn't be standing out in the open with something like that. You know how people disappear over things far less important than whatever you're holding. You raise a brow, keeping your posture relaxed, even though you're highly aware that this entire interaction is teetering dangerously close to real trouble. That sounds suspiciously like advice, his lips twitch, an amused expression flickering across his face. It is. Consider it free. You won't get many things for free in this business. but I do find it entertaining to watch someone decide whether to be reckless or smart. You tilt your head slightly, forcing yourself to look just disinterested enough to seem difficult to persuade. An old trick, but one that sometimes works on people who enjoy the chase more than the outcome. And which one are you hoping for? Reckless would be fun, he admits. Smart would be more useful. So that's it, then. He wants something from you. You knew that before. Of course you did. But now you have confirmation that this isn't just curiosity or some chance meeting in the dark. He's already decided you have value. And if you have value, that means he's willing to invest time in seeing where this leads. You shift your weight slightly, considering his words, your options. The sheer ridiculousness of the entire situation you've found yourself in. You seem awfully invested in this for someone who isn't involved, you say, slowly, carefully. He chuckles, shaking his head. Oh, I'm involved, he corrects. You just haven't figured out how yet. Wonderful. Fantastic. That's exactly what you needed tonight. Another layer of mystery stacked on top of the absolute mess you've already found yourself tangled in. You sigh, adjusting the parchment, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down again, unavoidable, insistent. Fine. You mutter. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that I'm considering doing something smart. He smiles, and somehow, that makes you more suspicious. I'm listening. You glance down briefly at the parchment in your hands, then back at him, meeting his gaze evenly. Why should I trust you? His laughter is quiet, knowing, almost appreciative, like you just asked a question he was hoping you'd think of. You shouldn't, he replies easily. But you should trust that I have a way out of this mess that doesn't end with you dead in a gutter. And that, right now, is probably the most useful thing I can offer. You inhale slowly, tapping your thumb against the folded parchment, weighing every possible answer, every risk, every potential regret. And then, against your better judgment, you ask the inevitable. What's your way out? He grins, and you already know you're about to regret asking. But at this point, you're too deep in to stop now. This was never going to end simply, and you're starting to realize maybe you never actually wanted it to. You watch him, searching his expression for something, hesitation, deception, a flicker of insincerity that tells you he's bluffing about this so-called way out. But he gives you nothing. Just that same infuriating smile, like he already knows exactly how this is going to unfold. Like this isn't a negotiation at all, but merely a performance where you've already rehearsed the role you're about to play, and he's just waiting for you to finally admit it. The parchment still weighs heavy in your hands, though now it's not the physical weight that bothers you. It's the fact that it is no longer yours alone. There's another player now, another presence in this game, and whether you like it or not, that means you are not the only one deciding the outcome anymore. All right, you say, slowly, carefully, like you're measuring every syllable before releasing it into the night. Tell me your way out. He exhales, not dramatically, but deliberately, as if this is a moment he has been waiting for, a piece of the puzzle that finally slots into place. He doesn't rush, doesn't immediately start rattling off some grand escape plan, because he knows the art of controlled pacing. The moment had to feel earned, and unfortunately for you, he had mastered that art long before this conversation ever began. You can't just return it, he says, matter-of-factly, as if there had ever been a world in which that was a simple option. You can't sell it either, not unless you want to put a price on your own survival and holding on to it forever. He tilts his head slightly, considering, then shakes it. Well, that would be ambitious. But ultimately useless, because secrets don't stay still for long, no matter how tightly you clutch them. You resist the urge to roll your eyes, because, yes, obviously, you were aware that this was a terrible situation with terrible choices. You didn't need someone to summarize how doomed you were. You needed something tangible, something that didn't end with your unfortunate body being discovered in a back alley 3 days from now. Lovely speech. You mutter, I'm riveted, but you're still avoiding the part where you actually tell me what the way out is. That damned smile again. The kind that says he's enjoying this a little too much. The kind that reminds you he has the advantage here, and you are merely catching up. There's another message, he says finally. One that hasn't been delivered yet. Your breath stills, just enough for you to register the shift in the conversation. The new layer being added, the additional piece to the story you weren't prepared for. You're telling me there's more? You say flatly. I'm telling you that what you're holding is only half the game. He corrects, calmly, confidently, like someone who absolutely thrives on information and enjoys watching other people process it. Just a little too late. The real trouble starts when the second half arrives. Because whoever wrote that. He gestures briefly toward your coat, where the parchment is safely tucked away. They weren't sending just one message, and if you intercepted part of it, a pause. A deliberate moment of silence to let the weight of the realization settle. Then you're already too involved to walk away now. Oh, perfect. Absolutely fantastic. What a spectacular, ridiculous, painfully avoidable mess this has turned into. So what you're telling me, you say, exhaling sharply, trying very hard not to sound like you regret every decision that led you to this moment, is that even if I wanted to pretend this never happened, someone else is going to make sure I stay involved anyway. He shrugs, not apologetic, not particularly sympathetic, just resigned. Like this is how these things always go. You took the wrong thing at the wrong time, he says simply. And now you're part of something bigger. But that doesn't have to be bad. You let out a dry laugh, because what a beautiful lie that was. Yes, you say? Because being tangled in treasonous letters and mysterious informants is usually the start of something very cheerful. He grins, shaking his head, almost like he's impressed by your ability to stay sarcastic in the face of such a spectacular disaster. You still have a choice, he says finally. But it isn't about whether to be involved. It's about how you handle it. You want to argue, to push back against the inevitability of it all, but deep down, you already know he's right. You know that whatever you decide now, it won't change the fact that you have been pulled into something much bigger than yourself. The parchment in your coat is not just ink and paper anymore. It's a path, a problem, and a puzzle you have no choice but to solve. And maybe, just maybe, you've never actually wanted to walk away at all. Which means the only thing left to do is figure out exactly how this all ends. And before you can dwell too much on what that ending might look like, you hear something just beyond the alleyway, footsteps approaching, quick, steady, purposeful. And suddenly, history is calling. Not just yours, not just his, but something much, much older. And now you're stepping directly into it. Because medieval espionage was never just one story. It was many stories. Spies, secrets, betrayals, all tangled together. And you're about to meet the ones who came before you. Because this game didn't start with you. It started centuries ago. And it is time to uncover it properly. So, let's begin. You adjust your stance, shifting slightly in the dim alleyway, still holding onto the weight of the parchment, tucked against your chest. Your story isn't the first of its kind. You're merely another name in a long history of deception, espionage, and extremely questionable decisions made under the cover of darkness. And speaking of questionable decisions, let's talk about Alfred the Great. Now, you may think medieval kings operated with dignity, power, and an overwhelming sense of noble authority. But no, sometimes even a king had to get creative. And by creative, we mean sneaking into an enemy camp, dressed as a bard while aggressively strumming a harp. Let's set the scene. It's 878 AD, and things are not looking great for England. The Danes, those enthusiastic, highly skilled Viking invaders who had been making Alfred's life miserable, had taken control of a huge portion of the land. Alfred, who should have been sitting on a throne, making grand political decisions, was instead hiding in the marshes, regrouping, plotting, and figuring out how to reclaim his kingdom without immediately getting himself killed. And what's the best way to gather critical intelligence on the enemy army without drawing suspicion? Disguise yourself as a wandering minstrel and waltz right into their camp, of course. So, that's exactly what King Alfred, mind you, did. He ditched his royal robes, grabbed a harp, and set off into enemy territory like he had absolutely nothing to lose. Now, medieval minstrels had one very important skill that made them perfect spies. They were seen as harmless entertainment, meant to play music, sing about heroic deeds, and ensure that highly trained warriors had something vaguely cheerful to listen to between battles. They weren't expected to be dangerous, important, or even particularly competent at anything beyond musical performance, which was perfect, because it meant no one would suspect the man behind the harp was actually the very ruler they were supposed to be hunting down and overthrowing. And it worked. Alfred wandered through the Danish camp, strumming his harp, listening to conversations, absorbing battle plans, all while pretending to be nothing more than a simple musician, traveling through the land, performing for coin, and definitely not secretly planning England's counterattack. Imagine it, soldiers laughing, feasting, completely unaware that the man they were listening to was actively preparing their downfall while plucking notes on a stringed instrument. It wasn't just bold, it was outrageously audacious, and it paid off. Alfred gathered enough intelligence to launch a successful counterattack, reclaiming his kingdom, defeating the Danes at the Battle of Edington, and solidifying his place in history as one of England's greatest rulers. But let's not forget the real takeaway here. This wasn't just about military strategy, leadership, or clever tactics. This was about a king willing to sneak into enemy lines while playing medieval karaoke and somehow getting away with it. Espionage, deception, and a harp. Truly history at its finest. Edward III wasn't just a king. He was an architect of deception, a ruler who understood that wars weren't won solely on the battlefield, but in the shadows, through secrets, whispers, and the kind of espionage that made even the most paranoid rulers lose sleep at night. And if you thought medieval spies were just hooded figures slipping notes under tavern tables, think again, because Edward III was running one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks of his time, and half of his spies were probably sitting in church pews pretending to pray while mentally recording enemy battle plans. Let's set the stage. It's the late 1330s, and tensions between England and France are so thick you could spread them on medieval bread and call it a diplomatic disaster. Edward II, determined to reclaim territories he believed were rightfully his, wasn't just sending armies to clash swords. He was sending spies to slip between enemy lines, quietly unraveling France's defenses before the real fight even began. His method: disguised deception, and just a little bit of divine misdirection. Edward's espionage network didn't rely on obvious spies. No dramatic figures in cloaks lurking in alleyways. No suspicious messages hidden in wine bottles, probably. No, he sent monks, merchants, and even nuns. Because who would suspect a nun of gathering military intelligence? Exactly no one. And that's what made it brilliant. His agents blended seamlessly into the fabric of medieval society, walking freely through France's towns, cities, and castles. Overhearing conversations, gathering intelligence, and returning with crucial details about troop movements, supply chains, and weaknesses in France's defenses. Imagine it: Edward's spies sitting in quiet monasteries, nodding solemnly as French knights confessed their war strategies over bread and wine, all while mentally filing away every useful detail. The nobility, assuming God was their only witness, spoke freely around monks, never realizing that the very prayers they were hoping for were being replaced with coded reports sent back to England. And merchants. Well, everyone loves talking in markets, discussing supply lines, upcoming military campaigns, and just how much grain a passing army might need to pillage. And Edward's agents listened to it all, casually selling cloth or spices, while making note of which regions were stockpiling weapons. Then there were the nuns, the true unsuspecting champions of espionage. Because if a noblewoman in France needed to confess her deep concerns about the war effort, who better to listen than a woman devoted to God? It was deception at its most holy, and nobody ever saw it coming. While other rulers were sending obvious spies, in disguises that barely worked, Edward III had literal clergy members operating as intelligence gatherers, walking through castles with quiet reverence, while mentally documenting every bit of strategic insight they could overhear from careless French officers. And what did Edward do with all this information? Exactly what you'd expect. He used it to absolutely dismantle France's ability to prepare for war before they even realized what was happening. While the French were organizing their armies, Edward was already positioning his troops where they would do the most damage. While France was discussing alliances and supply routes, England was cutting off their access to reinforcements and weakening their forces before they even marched. It was warfare through intelligence, and frankly, France never stood a chance. When the 100 Years' War officially began in 1337, Edward was already several steps ahead, thanks to the silent network of informants who had ensured his armies knew where to strike first, how France was preparing, and which weaknesses to exploit. And when the English won a string of early battles, it wasn't just because of military strategy or superior forces. It was because Edward's spies had ensured France never got the chance to fight on equal footing. Edward III didn't just send soldiers into battle. He sent whispers before them, ensuring that by the time swords were drawn, the real fight had already been won. And that truly is the mark of a ruler who understood that wars weren't about brute strength alone. They were about knowing exactly where your enemy was weakest, before they ever got the chance to prove otherwise. So while medieval espionage often involved dramatic disguises and cryptic messages, Edward III perfected the art of deception through the most unassuming figures imaginable. Because when your spies are the very people your enemy trusts the most, you don't just gather intelligence, you control the war before it ever truly begins. The art of medieval espionage didn't fade. It evolved, adapted, and became even more ridiculous as the stakes grew higher. By the early 1400s, the 100 Years' War was in full swing, and if Edward Arce's spying antics had been impressive, Henry V took it a step further. Because if England was going to crush the French in battle, it needed more than good soldiers. It needed information, strategy, and the kind of deep, cut intelligence that could turn a fight before the first sword was even drawn. And that meant spies. Lots of them. Enter the medieval double agent, a man who could blend in, talk too much L's on purpose, and ensure that secrets flowed like the questionable, all being served in war-torn taverns. Because if Henry V's army was going to march with confidence, they needed every scrap of information possible. What were the French planning? Were their soldiers actually competent? Were they prepared for war, or just desperately hoping England would get bored and leave them alone? The best place to find answers: where people drank. Taverns weren't just places for strong ale and bad decisions. They were hubs for loose tongues, where men boasted about their plans, exaggerated their victories, and unknowingly leaked military secrets to anyone pretending to be equally drunk, but was secretly listening very carefully. That's where spies thrived, because while the nobility was cautious, guarded, whispering in the halls of castles, the soldiers were loud, reckless, and eager to brag about their upcoming campaigns, all while enjoying a fresh tankard of beer. Henry V understood this perfectly, and he made sure his network of informants was fully integrated into the tavern scene. Spies disguised as wandering mercenaries, traveling merchants, and general friendly strangers slid into conversation, laughing, drinking, asking just enough casual questions to let the real soldiers spill every secret they shouldn't be saying out loud. And the best part, nobody ever suspected them, because who would assume some random guy in a corner with a half-empty tankard was quietly collecting the war strategies of an entire French battalion? Of course, espionage wasn't just about eavesdropping in taverns. Some spies operated at an entirely different level. The code breakers, men who could unravel hidden messages, intercept crucial letters, and decode the kind of clever writing meant only for commanders and kings. These weren't just casual informants. They were the true intellectual backbone of Henry's espionage force, ensuring that anything written by the enemy was promptly read by the English before the French ever got to act on it. And then, of course, there were the professional liars, the agents sent directly into French territory to slip into meetings, pose as loyalists, and pretend they belonged among the enemy ranks. These men weren't just listening from a distance. They were actively misleading, feeding false intelligence, misdirecting plans, and ensuring that by the time the French realized they had been played, it was already far too late to correct their mistakes. All of this, every bit of espionage, deception, and manipulation, built up to the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. By the time Henry V faced the French in battle, he wasn't just prepared. He had been handed their weaknesses on a silver platter, thanks to the spies who had already done the real damage before a single arrow was even fired. And when the battle was over, when England decimated the French forces despite being severely outnumbered, it wasn't just military skill. It was preparation, intelligence, and pure strategic advantage gained through months of carefully collected espionage. Henry V didn't just fight the French. He outthought them before they ever stepped onto the battlefield. And really, that's the true magic of medieval spying. Because sometimes, wars weren't won with swords. They were won over drinks, lies, and letters stolen in the dead of night. And in 1415, Henry V proved it better than anyone. And Venice wasn't just a picturesque city floating on canals. It was a ruthless, cunning, espionage-ridden powerhouse where secrets were currency and anonymity was weaponized to perfection. And if medieval spies had a central headquarters, it was Venice. Because no place was more committed to gathering intelligence, monitoring every citizen, and ensuring that treason was dealt with before it even had the chance to materialize. At the heart of this deeply paranoid, incredibly effective system was the Council of Ten. A group so powerful they might as well have been the medieval version of a shadow government, running Venice with secrets, spies, and just a little bit of sheer intimidation. Officially, they were established in 1310, but let's be honest, espionage had already been a major part of Venetian politics long before they decided to formalize their grip on intelligence and put a name on it. The Council of Ten didn't just exist. They controlled everything from surveillance to foreign affairs to internal security. If a whisper of treason existed anywhere in the city, the Council of Ten knew about it, processed it, and ensured it was erased before it became a real problem. And how did they do this? By creating a system that made secrecy into an art form. Picture it, a city governed by whispers, anonymous complaints, spies woven into the fabric of daily life, and highly secretive trials that made sure problems disappeared quietly before they ever turned into revolutions. Because Venice wasn't just an economic giant, it was a ticking political time bomb, surrounded by foreign enemies, threatened by internal plots, and absolutely unwilling to let power slip through its fingers. Let's start with the anonymous complaints, because really, this was the medieval equivalent of a government controlled suggestion box, except instead of complaining about potholes or bad trade deals, people were ratting each other out for suspected treason and political misconduct. Anonymous tip-offs were actively encouraged because Venice understood that the best way to uncover plots wasn't through traditional policing, but through the paranoia and opportunism of its own citizens. And these weren't just letters tossed onto some bureaucrat's desk to be read at a later date. No. They had designated drop points, literal carved lion mouths scattered throughout Venice, where citizens could submit their suspicions, complaints, or outright accusations against others. You saw your neighbor whispering to a foreign merchant in a suspicious manner. Throw it in the box. Did a nobleman seem a little too eager to discuss policies that sounded vaguely treasonous? Drop it in the lion's mouth. It was efficient, ruthless, and deeply unsettling, because at any given moment, you had no idea if someone had reported you. And that was exactly the point. Then, of course, there were the spies, because relying solely on civilian paranoia wasn't enough. The Council of Ten employed a vast network of informants, infiltrating every corner of society, ensuring that taverns, marketplaces, and elite gatherings were all monitored. The most harmless-looking individuals could have been directly connected to Venice's intelligence network, quietly listening, reporting, and ensuring that any mention of sedition was documented long before it turned into an actual threat. The beauty and terror of this system was that you never knew if you were talking to a spy. That charming merchant might be relaying everything you just said back to the council. That nun offering quiet prayers could be an informant gathering intelligence under the cover of piety. The man pouring your wine might not just be serving drinks. He might be serving Venice itself. And what happened when someone was accused? Well, trial was a generous word for what occurred next. The Council of Ten wasn't in the business of public spectacles. There were no grand accusations, No dramatic courtroom scenes. No chaotic trials where defendants could make impassioned speeches about their innocence. If you were suspected of treason, corruption, or generally being a problem, your fate was decided swiftly and quietly, behind closed doors, without public involvement. Secret trials ensured that only the accused and those making decisions knew exactly what was happening. If the council deemed someone too dangerous to remain in Venetian society, they weren't publicly executed or banished with fanfare. They simply disappeared. Some were exiled, sent far away from Venice, stripped of their wealth, forced into obscurity. Others, well, some records never told the full story, and in a city run by shadows, it's easy to imagine how certain individuals might have simply stopped existing one day, their names fading, their presence erased. And the brilliance of it all, nobody ever truly questioned it. Because Venice was thriving, powerful, wealthy, a dominant force in trade and diplomacy. And part of the reason for that was its ability to control unrest before it even started. The Council of Ten ensured Venice's political stability in a way that few other medieval governments could match. Through intelligence, secrecy, and a relentless commitment to eliminating threats before they even had the chance to become real problems. For nearly 500 years, this system ruled the city, adapting, evolving, ensuring that Venice remained one step ahead in espionage, diplomacy, and internal security. And by the time the council was officially dissolved in 1797, the world had already begun moving away from shadow governance and secret trials, at least officially. But the influence of Venetian espionage didn't vanish. It set the stage for the future of intelligence operations, proving that if you controlled information, you controlled everything. And Venice controlled everything for centuries, without anyone truly realizing just how deep the surveillance ran. If Venice had its network of spies, the medieval church had its own brand of intelligence gathering. And by intelligence, we mean relentless investigations, deeply questionable accusations, and enough paranoia to make even the most innocent peasant wonder if their local baker was secretly working for the Inquisitors. Because between the 13th and 15th centuries, if you so much as sneezed at the wrong time, owned a slightly suspicious-looking book, or had an unusually enthusiastic knowledge of the stars, someone could absolutely decide you were a heretic. And once that label stuck, you were in serious trouble. It all started when the church decided heresy wasn't just an unfortunate misunderstanding, but a direct threat to religious authority. And when you declare something a threat, you start actively hunting it down. Thus, the rise of Purple Inquisitors. Officials sent out to investigate, interrogate, and generally ruin someone's week if they showed even a vague inclination toward heretical thought. And while it's easy to assume they only targeted rebellious scholars or radical religious figures, nope, absolutely anyone could find themselves on the wrong end of an inquiry. Including peasants, because apparently, even making cheese was dangerous if someone decided your dairy practices looked a little too mystical. See, medieval communities operated on a very delicate balance of social trust. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone relied on everyone. And everyone, at some point, probably annoyed everyone. Which meant that if someone didn't like you, if you owed them money, if you insulted their bread, if they disliked the way you stared at the moon on Wednesday evenings, it wasn't entirely impossible for them to accuse you of heresy. And accusations, those got taken seriously. Imagine it. You've been living peacefully, minding your own business, occasionally discussing interesting ideas about philosophy or natural science, when suddenly Your neighbor decides that your mild curiosity about planetary movement is clearly the work of dark forces. They whisper just enough to the right people, and the next thing you know, someone wearing church robes is knocking on your door, asking deeply unpleasant questions about your nighttime habits. Papal inquisitors weren't just asking casual theological questions and calling it a day. They conducted full-scale investigations, collecting testimonies from neighbors, evaluating possessions for anything remotely suspicious, and, if necessary, encouraging confessions through less than friendly means. And confessions were important, because once you confessed, the church could officially record your wrongdoing, correct your errors, and move on. But if you refused to confess, well, things got significantly less pleasant. Medieval punishment wasn't gentle, nor was it particularly interested in fairness. If an inquisitor was convinced you were guilty, you were in a very dangerous position, and appealing your case was not exactly a simple process. Sometimes, suspected heretics were forced to undergo public penance, wearing distinctive clothing, standing before crowds, being humiliated into repentance. Other times, punishments were much worse, involving exile, imprisonment, or in particularly dramatic cases, execution. And the biggest tragedy: not everyone accused was actually guilty of anything. Some people were simply caught in unfortunate rumors, tangled in social disputes, or genuinely misunderstood by their communities. But once an accusation spread, it was nearly impossible to undo it. And that paranoia ensured everyone tread carefully, avoided unnecessary suspicion, and maybe kept their enthusiasm for certain intellectual topics to themselves. Ultimately, the Papal Inquisition wasn't just about religious enforcement. It was about control, influence, and the overwhelming power of fear. Because if people were terrified of being accused, they self-regulated, avoided rebellion, and ensured that the church's authority remained unquestioned. And that was medieval espionage at its most terrifying. Not spies in the shadows, not coded letters in secret exchanges, just ordinary people whispering, watching, waiting, turning against each other for survival. And the church, it watched, it listened, and it never forgot. Because once you were a suspect, you were a suspect forever. If medieval espionage had a golden age of deception, Catherine de' Medici made sure it included strategically placed courtly intrigue, perfectly planned seduction, and the kind of manipulation that made even the most experienced diplomats sweat. Forget hidden daggers and cryptic messages. Catherine weaponized charm, elegance, and scandal, turning gossip into an intelligence network so effective that nobody even realized they were being spied on until it was far too late. Her secret force, the Flying Squadron, a carefully selected group of ladies in waiting who weren't just present for courtly etiquette, but were actively used as informants, infiltrators, and walking distractions. Some called them companions, others called them honey traps. But one thing was clear: they weren't there just to look pretty. Let's step into the 16th century French court, where power was fragile, alliances shifted like the wind, and secrets were currency traded more aggressively than gold. Catherine de' Medici, a woman who knew that survival was never about brute strength, but about outthinking her enemies, needed a way to control the chaos surrounding her rule. And what better way to keep rivals close than to use the very environment they thrived in against them? She gathered a squadron of intelligent, highly trained noblewomen, placing them strategically among the most influential men in court, not just for show, but for gathering information, steering conversations, and ensuring Catherine always knew what her enemies were thinking. before they even had the chance to act on it. Picture it. French nobles, military leaders, foreign diplomats, all believing they were simply enjoying pleasant companionship, engaging in charming conversation, basking in the elegance of courtly life. And all the while, Catherine's informants were listening carefully, memorizing every careless admission, every whispered plan, every ambitious scheme, muttered between wine refills. These weren't mere distractions. They were calculated infiltrators, experts at digging out rivalries, exposing treachery, and subtly steering conversations to uncover exactly what Catherine needed to know. And because nobody suspected that a well-mannered, beautifully dressed noblewoman was actively dismantling their political strategies, the squadron was one of the most successful intelligence networks of the era. It wasn't just about seduction, though that was certainly a tool used when necessary. It was about deception, redirection, and ensuring that power remained firmly in Catherine's hands. If a noble was wavering in loyalty, suddenly, he found himself deeply engaged in discussions with a charming companion, who, by complete coincidence, just happened to steer him away from rebellion. If an enemy of Catherine planned a coup, somehow word reached her well before swords could be raised, ensuring she could squash trouble before it ever truly began. And the best part, nobody realized they had been played, because Catherine's squadron didn't snatch secrets aggressively or expose plots publicly. They allowed men to ruin themselves, walking straight into their own admissions of guilt, all while believing they were in control. It was espionage disguised as courtly tradition, an intelligence operation that worked under the guise of etiquette, charm, and nobility, ensuring that France's political landscape remained a playground of calculated power plays, where Catherine always had the upper hand. The flying squadron was not just a collection of ladies in waiting. They were Catherine's personal chess pieces, expertly moved across the board to ensure victory before the opponent even realized there was a game being played. So while other rulers relied on spies lurking in shadows, Catherine de' Medici let espionage walk straight into the halls of power, dressed elegantly, smiling sweetly, and ensuring that every secret France had to offer made its way back to her first. And honestly, that is medieval manipulation at its finest. Richard the Lionheart wasn't just a warrior king, he was a strategist. A ruler who knew that brute strength alone wouldn't win the Crusades. Battles weren't fought only with swords and siege engines. They were won through planning, intelligence, and knowing exactly what the enemy was doing before they did it. And if Richard was going to march through the Holy Land, leading his forces against Saladin and attempting to carve out victories in a deeply contested region, he needed more than just knights and war horses. He needed spies, informants, and a steady stream of intelligence flowing directly into his war councils. That meant gathering eyes and ears where traditional scouts couldn't go, slipping agents into enemy territory, and making sure that while the Saracens plotted their next move, England's king was already anticipating it. And how did he achieve that? By utilizing one of the most chaotic, unpredictable espionage networks imaginable, an ever-shifting band of merchants, scribes, diplomats, disguised messengers, and, yes, the occasional juggler who had absolutely no business being involved in medieval warfare, but somehow played a role anyway. Because when you needed to move information through a hostile landscape, where every road could lead to ambush, and every conversation could be overheard, you had to use methods that nobody would suspect. And who suspects a traveling trader? Who questions a wandering entertainer, a humble musician, a scholar seeking knowledge? Nobody, which is exactly why these people made the perfect spies. The Crusades were not just grand military campaigns. They were intricate webs of politics, diplomacy, and deception, and Richard understood the necessity of controlling information, as much as controlling the battlefield. While his knights trained and prepared for siege warfare, his informants were already slipping through Saladin's strongholds, gathering intelligence, listening in on casual discussions, and ensuring that Richard never launched an attack blindly. And since this was the 12th century, where medieval warfare was as unpredictable as the weather, communication had to be fast, secure, and disguised as ordinary travel. Caravans moved through enemy lands, carrying goods, supplies, and just a little bit of highly sensitive military intelligence hidden among the grains, spices, and silks. A merchant traveling from one city to another was expected to bring news, expected to exchange gossip in marketplaces, hear about troop movements, listen to complaints about taxes and resource shortages. And all of this was valuable, because sometimes military strength wasn't measured in steel and castles, but in how much you knew about your opponent before they knew about you. Richard's network relied on movement, constant flowing, seemingly harmless, because standing still meant vulnerability. His agents weren't concentrated in one place, but spread across trading posts, pilgrimage routes, embassies, and even Saracen courts, because gathering intelligence required proximity, but not suspicion. Sometimes, scribes traveling under the guise of religious scholars would sit quietly among noble gatherings, listening to conversations meant only for trusted members of Saladin's court. Other times, messengers disguised as simple servants would carry letters between allies, ensuring that no strategic orders ever fell into enemy hands. And then there were the entertainers, the ones who could slip into the heart of rival camps without raising a single alarm, performing for crowds, moving between warriors, overhearing discussions that no sensible spy could ever dream of infiltrating. A juggler, a musician, a fool spinning riddles and jokes. Not exactly someone you'd expect to walk away with knowledge of battle formations and supply routes. But if history has proven anything, it's that deception often works best when disguised as complete absurdity. And Richard wasn't just gathering intelligence on military strategies. He was actively manipulating political alliances. Spies positioned within enemy territories weren't just watching troops move. They were listening to rival factions plot against each other, learning where trust faltered, where resentment brewed, where a well-timed betrayal could turn an entire city to his favor. Because war wasn't just about winning fights. It was about making sure the enemy couldn't fight at all. If Richard knew who Saladin could rely on, and who might be questioning their loyalties, he could turn those fractures into full-blown divisions, dismantling the strength of his opponent without ever needing to engage in direct combat. And that meant keeping informants everywhere, maintaining an unseen network of whispers where a simple conversation in a market could determine the fate of an entire fortress. Of course, espionage during the Crusades was dangerous work. These weren't trained spies hidden in safe houses, quietly decoding messages from behind castle walls. No, these were ordinary people, moving through enemy-controlled landscapes, constantly risking exposure. And if an informant was discovered, they weren't treated kindly. Punishment was swift, brutal, and often final, because the idea of intelligence gathering wasn't just a military threat. It was seen as deeply dishonorable. Spies weren't treated like prisoners of war. They were treated like criminals, deceivers, men who betrayed trust and violated the sacred unspoken rules of honorable combat. And yet, they continued, because information was worth more than gold, more than land, more than castles. Because if Richard's forces moved with certainty, knowing exactly what awaited them beyond each battle, they could outmaneuver, outthink, and outlast their enemies even in the most hopeless situations. And it worked. Richard's tactics, informed by espionage, intelligence, and relentless surveillance, allowed him to win battles that should have been impossible, outmaneuvering Saladin at key moments, securing victories through precise planning rather than reckless conquest. Even when resources were strained, even when the odds were stacked against his forces, Richard's army held strong, not just because of brute force, but because they were always prepared. The Crusades were a bloody, brutal, unforgiving conflict, but in the midst of the clashes and sieges, there was an unseen war. A war fought with whispers, coded letters, hidden messages slipped between sacks of grain and bundles of silk, traders carrying far more than just goods across enemy lines. And Richard, he wasn't just leading knights into battle. He was leading spies into the heart of the enemy's cities, ensuring that by the time swords were drawn, victory was already well within his grasp. And when the dust settled, it wasn't just Richard's soldiers who had won him battles. It was the scribes, the merchants, the messengers, the unseen force that ensured he always knew more than his enemies. Because in war, knowing more meant losing less, and nobody understood that better than England's most legendary Crusader king. While Richard the Lionheart's network of spies had helped shape the Crusades and redefine medieval warfare through intelligence, deception, and diplomacy, the legacy of strategic espionage didn't die with his reign. It evolved, adapted, and became even more desperate as military conflicts grew increasingly brutal. And nowhere was this desperation more evident than at Che to Gaylard, a fortress built with the specific purpose of being an impenetrable stronghold, yet one that ultimately proved that even the most formidable defenses could crumble under the weight of relentless siege tactics and some truly questionable infiltration strategies. Because medieval warfare wasn't just about who had the most knights or the strongest castle walls. It was about who could get inside those walls first, preferably without getting stabbed. And while spies, scouts, and informants had long been crucial to military success, the siege of Chiu, Gaylard took the concept of infiltration to new levels of creativity, determination, and frankly, deep personal humiliation. Because when all else failed, sometimes the best way into a fortress was through its latrines. Let's set the stage. It's 1203, and the conflict between England and France has reached a particularly unpleasant level of aggression. With King Philip Tumbuyer of France doing everything in his power to reclaim territory that Richard the Lionheart had once secured under English control. Che to Gaylard, perched atop the Seine River, was Richard's personal masterpiece. A fortress designed to withstand sieges, repel invaders, and generally ruin the day of anyone who tried to storm it. It had layered defenses, fortified walls, strategic positioning, and an architectural brilliance that made it one of the strongest castles of its time. But here's the thing about medieval fortresses. They were only as strong as the people defending them. And the siege of Che to Gaylard wasn't going to be won through brute force alone. It was going to be won through persistence, espionage, and one extremely unfortunate infiltration method that involved crawling through literal sewage. Philip's army surrounded the fortress, cutting off supplies, launching attacks. and making sure that no reinforcements could reach the English garrison trapped inside. The defenders, under John Lackland's reign, held out with grim determination, repelling assaults, fortifying their positions, and fully believing that they could outlast the siege with enough patience and well-placed arrows. But Philip was no fool. He knew that waiting endlessly outside the fortress wasn't a practical solution. He needed a way inside, and medieval armies, when faced with impossible defenses, had a tendency to get very creative with their problem solving. Enter spy networks, sabotage, and some truly unconventional tunnel tactics. Philip's forces knew that storming the walls outright would cost too many lives, so they turned to infiltration, deception, and gradual weakening of the fortress from within. They relied on scouts and informants, gathering intelligence from nearby towns, merchants, and even discontented individuals who had once been inside Che Tu Gaylord. Any small detail mattered. Food stores, guard rotations, overlooked weaknesses in the fortress's design. And Philip's spies worked tirelessly to piece together the best strategy for breaching the impenetrable castle. But then came the tunnels. Medieval sieges often relied on undermining, a tactic where attackers would dig beneath castle walls, destabilizing the foundations until portions of the fortress literally collapsed. Philip's engineers began excavation, carefully tunneling under sections of Che Tu Gaylord, chipping away at its strength without ever needing to launch a direct assault. And while the defenders worked desperately to counter these efforts, Philip's forces kept pushing forward, inching closer, weakening the very ground beneath the castle. But even as these siege tunnels progressed, the breakthrough that truly shifted the battle came from one of the most humiliating infiltration methods in history. Because if Philip's troops couldn't force their way through the gates, they were going to slip in through the smallest, most overlooked entry point possible, the latrines. Yes, the toilet chutes, because as it turns out, when you're desperate to get inside an impenetrable fortress, you start looking at every possible opening, and medieval plumbing was far less glamorous than anyone today would prefer to imagine. Che Tu Gaylord had a series of waste chutes leading from inside the fortress to the outer walls, meant to dispose of all the unpleasant byproducts of medieval life without contaminating the main living areas. And Philip's troops saw an opportunity, a filthy, deeply regrettable, but highly effective opportunity. They crawled through the latrine chutes, squeezing through narrow, disgusting tunnels, dragging themselves through questionable medieval waste, and emerging inside the very walls of Che Tu Gaylord, bypassing all the heavily defended gatehouses, bridges, and battlements entirely. It worked. Philip's forces slipped inside, catching the defenders completely off guard. The fortress, so carefully designed to withstand direct military assaults, hadn't accounted for the sheer determination of people willing to crawl through sewage for victory. Once inside, Philip's troops opened paths for more reinforcements, weakening the castle's defenses from within, dismantling its strategic advantages, and ensuring that Che Tu Gaylord's fall was now inevitable. In March 1204, after months of relentless pressure, spy infiltration, and tunnel tactics that would make any modern sanitation expert scream, Che Tu Gaylord finally fell. The fortress that Richard the Lionheart had once declared invincible was conquered, not by overwhelming force, but by patience, ingenuity, and an extremely unfortunate choice of entry point. But beyond the humiliation of toilet-based siege tactics, the fall of Che Tu Gaylord symbolized something much larger. The realization that even the strongest castles weren't truly invulnerable, and that espionage, sabotage, and unconventional warfare were just as crucial as swords and siege engines. Because medieval warfare wasn't just about brute strength. It was about finding weaknesses, exploiting opportunities, and ensuring that every battle ended before it even truly began. And sometimes, those opportunities were really disgusting. But if history has proven anything, it's that victory didn't care about dignity. It only cared about winning. And Philip T. He won. Horribly, but successfully. Because medieval espionage was never just about gathering intelligence. It was about crawling through a latrine, if that's what it took to win the war. While medieval warfare had its spies creeping through latrines and infiltrating court intrigues, another world existed entirely, one of commerce, trade, and quiet manipulation that never required a sword, but could ruin entire economies with the right piece of information. Because while knights clashed on the battlefield, merchants waged their own wars. Wars of supply chains, pricing schemes, and pure financial sabotage. And nowhere was this more evident than the Hanseatic League, the grand medieval merchant collective that didn't just trade goods. It traded secrets, controlled markets, and ensured that espionage worked just as efficiently for businessmen as it did for military strategists. The Hanseatic League was a powerhouse, a network of traders spanning across northern Europe, pooling resources, negotiating trade routes, and quietly ensuring that competition didn't just lose. It collapsed before it had the chance to fight back. And unlike traditional governments, which had official diplomacy, military alliances, and treaties, the Hanseatic League had something much more subtle and ruthless: merchant spies. These weren't robed figures sneaking through castle halls. These were traders, craftsmen, ship captains, and even brewers, men who knew exactly what was happening in rival cities before their competitors ever had a chance to react. Because if you controlled information, you controlled the market, and if you controlled the market, well, you controlled everything. Picture it: a seemingly harmless beer merchant unloading barrels at a bustling port in Ellebeck, exchanging pleasantries, asking about local demand, appearing interested in nothing more than business. But beneath his casual demeanor, hidden in the folds of his ledger, was information far more valuable than the price of barley. Notes on shipping delays, whispers of unrest in rival guilds, details on which cities were stockpiling grain and which were teetering on the edge of shortages. He wasn't just selling beer. He was collecting intelligence, ensuring that when the League made its next financial move, it had already accounted for every possible advantage. Because the Hanseatic League didn't just trade, it controlled trade. And that meant knowing which ports were thriving and which were struggling, where a city's economy was booming and where it could be strategically undermined. Take, for example, the wool trade, one of the most lucrative commodities of the era. While England produced some of the finest wool, the League's merchant spies ensured that English competitors never fully controlled the supply lines. Agents posing as humble cloth traders gathered reports on shipments, recorded details on shortages, and whispered useful intelligence to their allies, ensuring that the League always had leverage in negotiations, always had the upper hand when determining pricing, always dictated the terms, rather than accepting them. Because medieval commerce wasn't a friendly exchange of goods. It was a battlefield where victory meant economic dominance and defeat meant bankruptcy. And Hanseatic merchant spies operated like economic assassins, slipping into markets, blending among dock workers, gathering intelligence that dictated business decisions with surgical precision. And when rival cities attempted to undercut the League's prices, establish their own trade networks, or push back against their monopoly, the League didn't send armies, it sent information. Because sometimes a well-placed rumor about grain shortages could collapse an economy faster than an invading army ever could. And if history has taught us anything, it's that spies weren't just found in royal courts. They were found in every bustling market, every shipyard, every merchant hall where fortunes were made and lost with a single whispered secret. And the Hanseatic League, it whispered louder than anyone. By the time Eleanor of Aquitaine had firmly established herself as Queen Mother, her influence wasn't just political, it was social, strategic, and deeply embedded in every conversation whispered through the halls of power. If medieval espionage had a particularly elegant form, it was found in the courts, where alliances were crafted over banquets. Secrets slipped between pages of correspondence, and reputations were ruined with a well-placed whisper. And Eleanor, she didn't just listen to court intrigue. She actively curated it, shaping the flow of information through a carefully managed web of ladies, in-waiting, clerics, servants, and anyone remotely connected to royal affairs. This wasn't spying in the traditional sense. This was court politics at its most manipulative, and Eleanor wielded it like a master composer conducting a symphony of deception. Imagine it, a bustling medieval court, filled with nobles posturing for influence, ambassadors carefully choosing their words, knights boasting about their latest feats, and somewhere among it all, Eleanor's network, quietly absorbing every detail that passed between idle conversation. Because no piece of information was too insignificant, and no person too unimportant, to be part of this great web. A stable boy might overhear which nobles secretly visited the Queen's chambers. A bishop might let slip a controversial opinion about the King's latest decision. A lady in waiting might pick up on hesitation in an ambassador's tone, and all of it, every tiny piece of court life, funneled back to Eleanor, because knowing things before anyone else, that was power. Eleanor didn't need mercenaries sneaking through castle corridors or coded messages passed through hidden channels. She had access to the people who lived within the very walls, where politics unfolded, where decisions were made, where alliances cracked and reformed like shifting tides. Courtiers confided in each other. Servants listened when they weren't meant to, and everyone, absolutely everyone, was a potential source of information. And the best part, most people didn't even realize they were participating. This wasn't forceful interrogation. This was subtle manipulation. Conversations shaped by carefully placed observations, seemingly innocent remarks that led to revealing discussions. The ability to steer gossip without ever looking like you were involved at all. And Eleanor's ladies, in waiting. They were the backbone of the operation. Placed strategically in social circles, attending feasts, exchanging letters. Their roles weren't just to serve and assist. They were to listen, to notice, to report back. They weren't messengers in dark corners, carrying stolen scrolls. They were respected noblewomen who simply happened to know everything about everyone before anyone even realized their business was public knowledge. And what did Eleanor do with all of this information? Exactly what any master manipulator would. She shaped the course of politics through suggestion, influence, and knowing exactly which strings to pull before they were ever needed. When rivals whispered about rebellion, she already knew. When alliances wavered, she already anticipated it. When nobles schemed, hoping to outmaneuver her, she had already set the board before they even chose their first move. Because medieval courts weren't just centers of rule and governance. They were arenas for political survival, and Eleanor ensured her position was secured not just through power, but through knowledge, control, and a finely tuned understanding of how people could be played against one another without ever realizing it. And that was espionage at its most social, most elegant, and most ruthlessly effective. Because when the crown was at stake, sometimes all it took to win was a well-placed whisper. And Eleanor of Aquitaine, she was the best at making sure those whispers served her first. The Battle of Poitiers wasn't just a catastrophic French defeat. It was a lesson in how medieval warfare didn't end once the swords stopped clashing. Sure, the English crushed the French forces, scattered their cavalry, and captured John Touy of France himself. But what happened after? Well, the real intelligence work began. Because when you have a whole crowd of captured soldiers sitting around, talking, complaining, and reflecting on their mistakes, you have an opportunity. And the English, they weren't about to waste it. Picture it. French knights grumbling in makeshift camps, exhausted and frustrated, swapping battle stories, lamenting lost strategies, and discussing the next steps their commanders might take to recover from the disaster. They weren't planning treason. They weren't plotting grand escapes. They were simply talking the way soldiers do after a defeat, loudly, carelessly, and assuming nobody important was listening. Except someone was listening. Because every medieval army needed stable boys. Young men tending horses, hauling supplies, mucking out stalls, and generally existing in the background of military life. They weren't warriors, they weren't strategists. They were invisible. Just another part of the daily routine, ignored by the very men who should have been watching their tongues. Which is exactly why they made the perfect spies. Under the guise of casual laborers, English intelligence gatherers embedded themselves among the French prisoners, casually going about their work while overhearing everything. Frustrations over battle formations, theories on England's next move, speculation on reinforcements, insights into French morale, and even personal rivalries that could be exploited later. It was espionage at its most effortless, because the prisoners had no reason to suspect they were being monitored. Who's going to suspect the stable boy hauling buckets of water? Who's going to realize the servant adjusting saddles is taking mental notes on every strategic concern muttered within earshot? Nobody. And that's exactly how England ensured its next victories were already taking shape before the next battle had even begun. Even John Touy himself, the literal king of France, was kept under polite captivity, treated respectfully enough that he wasn't expecting any particular treachery, but watched closely enough that England always knew exactly what his court was thinking. And while he received visitors, held discussions, and debated tactics, English officials quietly ensured that anything useful he revealed wasn't just heard. It was acted upon. And what did all this stable-side espionage achieve? Well, by the time England was negotiating ransoms, setting political terms, and preparing its next campaigns, it wasn't operating blindly. It knew France's weak points, its internal divisions, its frustrations, and its desperation. And while the French forces were struggling to recover from Poitiers, England was already several steps ahead, quietly shaping the future of the conflict with intelligence gleaned from their own prisoners. Because in medieval warfare, capturing soldiers wasn't just about winning battles, it was about winning information. And sometimes that information came straight from the mouths of the very men who never realized they were giving it away. all because someone thought the stable boy didn't matter. And that was their greatest mistake. Capturing French prisoners had provided the English with everything they needed. Not just soldiers to ransom, but information, whispers, and battle plans revealed under the assumption that stable boys weren't listening. But while victories were won in the field, power was secured in writing, and nothing embodied that more than the secret Treaty of Troyes in 1420. Because medieval warfare wasn't just about clashing armies. Sometimes it was about sweaty messengers dodging arrows and ditches, hauling diplomatic secrets under their coats and hoping nobody intercepted their letters before they reached their intended destination. By the early 15th century, the 100 Years' War had spiraled into chaos, with England gaining momentum while France struggled with internal disputes, rebellions, and general disorganization. Henry V, who had already humiliated the French at Agincourt, wasn't just aiming for victory. He was aiming for the throne itself. Because while conquering land was nice, securing a bloodline-based claim to the French crown was even better, and he was about to achieve just that through one of the most audacious diplomatic maneuvers in medieval history. And of course, it all depended on spies, secret messengers, and men who had to sneak through hostile territory without losing their heads. The Treaty of Troyes wasn't negotiated in grand open assemblies. It was whispered, planned, concealed, and carried between hands that couldn't afford to let the wrong people see what they were up to. Henry V had used every intelligence network at his disposal. Informants embedded in French courts, spies mingling among French nobility, letters exchanged in the dead of night. Between those too valuable to be publicly associated with England's plot. Because if Charles VI of France was going to name Henry as his heir, it had to be done quietly, efficiently, and without giving rivals a chance to sabotage the deal. Imagine it. Messengers sweating through their doublets, gripping sealed scrolls, so tightly their knuckles turned white, ducking behind trees to avoid patrolling guards, hoping that whatever information they carried would reach its intended recipient before they were caught. Every road was a risk, every watchtower a potential disaster, every loose-lipped peasant an unknown variable. One misplaced word, one intercepted scroll, and the entire treaty could unravel before Henry's claim was secured. And yet, it worked. Through carefully orchestrated espionage, covert diplomacy, and just enough deception to keep rival factions from intervening in time, the Treaty of Troyes was signed in 1420, officially naming Henry V as the heir to the French throne. The very idea was unthinkable. An English king positioned to rule France itself, legally, through agreement rather than conquest. But Henry had outmaneuvered his opponents, using intelligence, information, and controlled secrecy to ensure that by the time the world knew what had happened, it was already too late to stop it. Of course, Henry died unexpectedly in 1422, before he could fully capitalize on his new title. But the treaty remained one of the most unbelievable political victories in medieval history. One achieved not through brute force alone, but through espionage, careful plotting, and messengers who probably ran faster than they ever had in their entire lives, just to make sure those letters weren't lost on the way. So, now that we've followed spies through battlefields, castles, latrine tunnels, court intrigues, and highly suspect diplomatic negotiations, I think it's time for you to slip into your own covert operation, called getting some sleep. Because while medieval spies had to stay awake to survive, you just have to close your eyes and pretend you're not in the middle of a ruthless medieval intelligence mission. So go to sleep, before I send a stable boy to eavesdrop on you snoring. Good night, Agent. Mission accomplished.